Let's take a look at some history about vampires. In class, we learned about vampires in many different literary works and films. The first we learned about is Bram Stoker's Dracula. But what many do not know is that Stoker is actually said to have based the character of Dracula off Vlad the Impaler. Vlad the Impaler was a prince in 15th century Transylvania. Vlad was known to be very violent and even drink blood. Whether or not this is true, folklore paints a picture of a man who is very much the vampire type. Today we will look into the story of a real vampire. We will learn about her past and how she lives her life day to day. Let's take a look. Today we have the pleasure of sitting with Rachel, an actual vampire living among us in Nashville. So Rachel, thank you for letting us enter your life and answering the questions we all have been wondering about modern day vampires.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
So we will start with some questions so that our audience can learn a little more about your history and your life. From many different sources about vampires, we know that many vampires have been alive much longer than humans. Can you share with us your life before you became a vampire?
Well, Madeline, I was born in 1841 to a prominent family in the antebellum South on a plantation in Alabama. But I spent most of my life in London, England, being educated. I had a very privileged childhood, but at age 20, the South went to war with the North. So as many of my peers, I went to help aid the military hospitals in the war.
Looking at you now, you do not appear much older than the age you were when the war began.
Well, looking at me now is not too much different than looking at me back then, because that same year was the year that I was turned.
If you don't mind me asking, can you tell us about when you were turned?
Not at all. It was a brigade was camped out near Prince William County, Virginia, waiting for the Battle of Bull Run. Since I had ended the war, I hadn't been with a company of men who were not soldiers in quite some time. But that all changed once I met Job, who I felt an immediate connection with. To make the story short, Job was the one that bit and tanned me.
If you don't mind me asking, what did it feel like to be turned, Rachel?
Oh, it was quite indescribable, honestly. My thirst for blood was intense. For many years after that, I went on a killing spree. Luckily, the country was at war, so it was very easily to go from the different campsite to kill soldiers and the nurses to quench my thirst during the night.
Well, that's very intense and brutal. What happened after the war?
Well, I was about 10 years after the war. I encountered Job again, and he invited me to join his coven. Since he was the one who had turned me and all, I felt an indescribable bond with him. So of course I accepted, and then they accepted me quickly as one of their own, and we became like a family, you could say.
Did you ever come across any other vampires?
Oh yes, there were many more in Europe than in America. Many vampires we came across lived alone, so we invited them to join our coven, but there were some we came across that couldn't control themselves, even when we tried to teach them. Margaret was always the one who decided if we were to invite the others in. I felt that it is better for our kind to be together, because it helps us control our urges better. So I felt it was important to bring in those who needed to be taught control, or occasionally we would invite those who we felt a connection with.
So your coven was in Europe when Bram Stoker's Dracula was first published.
Oh yes, it definitely stereotyped vampires, and most people were scared of the thought of our kind.
Well, in my notes here, once you came back to the United States in 1925, you were well into your 80s. What had changed about the world?
Well, I first went back to the South and found it to be much, much different than I remembered. It was still recovering from the war, and it was very, very poor. Everyone I had known when I was human was completely gone, wiped out.
So technically, Rachel, you're 173 years old. I'd imagine you've lived through many changes in the world. How is it different being a vampire in 2014 from when you originally turned?
You're right about that one. I've seen many changes in my time. But I remained very much the same woman when I was turned. Luckily, vampires have developed quite a following. I've been very amused with many of the movies and stories humans have come up with about vampires, although I must admit many are not very accurate to what life is really like for us.
Just a few more questions, Rachel. How do you feed your need for blood? There are many TV shows and movies that give alternatives to humans drinking to drinking human blood, such as Twilight, where vampires drink the blood of animals instead of human blood. Do these alternatives actually work?
I know what you're referencing to, and the answer to your question is no. Vampires cannot live off animal blood in order to survive. Unfortunately, we do have to drink human blood, and so we do have to kill in order to feed, but we do drink a lot of liquor, which helps.
Well, that was not the answer I was expecting. So do you kill innocent people in order to drink their blood?
Well, our coven has ways in which we decide from whom to drink from. We frequent many prisons during the night and kill people who we feel deserve, as opposed to the people who live good lives. Some may disagree, but we have to do what we have to do to survive. But in my 173 years, there have been many times where I have been so thirsty I have indeed had to kill innocent people, which I'm not proud of.
Well, Rachel, for my last question, what do you think it is important to know about vampires?
First of all, Maddie, I think it's important for people to know that nobody was turned into a vampire by choice. Our humanity was taken from us. If we had it our way, most of us would not choose to have lived for centuries surviving only by human blood and only being able to be outside when it's dark. And honestly, I guess if you have the choice of meeting a vampire, just don't. Don't.
Well, that about sums it up here. Thank you, Rachel, for meeting with me.
Of course.